Lucinda Brockway is owner of Past Designs right here in Kennebunk. She is an award-winning landscape designer and preservationist who serves a national clientele, including the National Trust, the Newport Restoration Foundation, and numerous state and federal preservation agencies. Today, she also works as the Senior Director of Cultural Resources for the Trustees of Reservations, leading public garden and cultural landscape preservation across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So that means it's very wonderful to have her knowledge and skill here with us today, and thank her for taking the time out of her day to do this. Lucinda, welcome, and I'm handing it over to you.
Terrific. Well, I'm hoping everybody can hear me now and see my screen. And as I say, I'm looking forward to talking to all of you at the end of this presentation. What I wanted to do today was to give you a little overview of New England landscape history from the 17th to the 20th century, and then take a look at some of the clues that you can look for in your own backyard to see if you can start to read the history that's all around you every day. As Cynthia said, I'm very fortunate to work with the Trustees of Reservations in Massachusetts. They were one of my clients for a very long time before I went to work for them. And I invite you to come to this landscape, which is out in Stockbridge, Massachusetts at Naumkeag. This is a national landmark property with a national landmark garden to it that we've been restoring for the past 10 years. And just like the museum buildings at the brick store, this is a labor of love that never ends. And it's constantly needing more money and more funds and things to do. Now, let me see. I can't seem to move my screen forward. Am I still considered a host in this whole thing, Deborah? Maybe you can.
Yeah, let me just make you a 1 second. All right, I've made you the host, so let's see if that helps.
Doesn't want to move us forward here.
Oh,
It worked before.
Hmm.
I'm going to stop sharing and go back in, and I'll share it again. So bear with me, everybody. There we go. Let's try this again. Might have just gotten tired, which happens sometimes. There, let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So I just wanted you to know that we often think about historic landscapes as being places like Naumkeag or this wonderful Ochre Court down in Newport, Rhode Island. But in fact, and I'm lucky, this is Castle Hill in Ipswich, another one of the properties I get to work on. So there are these wonderful examples of historic landscapes that we can go and visit and learn a lot from. And we try to teach everybody a lot about not only landscape design and landscape history, but landscape preservation through some of these sites that we work with. But also, there's history in these little backyards in Kennebunkport, or the backyards of the houses on Summer Street, or even the backyards of the houses on Brown Street and other parts here in Kennebunk and in the region. And those are the places where people and place and garden and horticulture and garden design all come together that speak of a particular time and a particular passion for the people that lived there. This happens to be a house on the corner of Pearl and Main Street in Kennebunkport that I worked on a number of years ago. And there were some wonderful articles back in 1913 that were poems that were published about this garden and written about this garden that we used for helping to bring a new garden to life based on what we knew about the old garden that was there. We also have a real wealth of native plant material and indigenous culture here in Maine that we can't ignore, and we actually should pay much, much more attention to than we have been. And so being able to think about the combination of native plants and introduced plants and history over time is this wonderful blending that allows us to really have a chance to take advantage of the huge variety of plant material that we have available and what it can tell us about the history of our region. These little dooryard gardens, backyard gardens, combinations of plants are all part of what we really are going to enjoy here today. I did want to start with the indigenous landscape because very often talks like this start with European settlement of New England, and it is ripe and rich now for us to be having these conversations with our indigenous cultural friends and learn much more about the way that they were looking at landscape, which is very, very different than the European view of landscape that came into this country in the 17th century. You can see here that if you look at the map of Maine, there's a broad range of cultures that cross this map that have no boundaries to them. And Europeans tended to put boundaries on everything. So even the boundary for Maine is a boundary that was created when Maine was settled. And this ability to be able to think about the landscape from its purest natural resource perspective, the waterways, the travelways, the kinds of woodland that was here, the rich resources that are in the waters of both salt and fresh water, especially here in southern Maine, the grasses, the flyways and the byways and the birds that are coming and going across these populations are all something that are very in tune with these early cultures in this region. And they had many ways of manipulating that landscape in order to be able to thrive. This is a wonderful picture that actually is on a website from the brick store that includes a 1585 image of fishing from the National Park Service. That fishing weir that you see, that little caged area that you see along the fence, we just found 2 of these under a sand dune in Ipswich, Massachusetts, with all of these storm changes that happened this year that have been revealed again. And so there's evidence of some of this physical structures that were part of this working landscape that we're still finding today. And I'm always thrilled to see them. If we could talk the Algonquin languages and we could learn about this relationship of their natural resources, you'd find that these are the translation of some of the words that they were speaking. I did a lot of work in Rhode Island, and Roger Williams' Key to the Language of America included the translations into Narragansett for these kinds of words. And you can see the corn, the grass, the fresh meadow, the worn out field, the new ground, the kinds of trees that they're thinking about. These are all important and representative of how they were using the landscape in their culture and describing it in their own words. It's interesting to look at their agricultural ecosystem because it did favor this mosaic landscape of forests in different stages of succession and a way of manipulating the landscape and food sources for maximized production, often using seasonal burning that created conditions that were favorable for grasses and small fruits and hunting without a lot of dry debris under your feet when you're hunting either birds or deer or mammals, other mammals. And so it became really important to think about the seasonal harnessing of that landscape, not just taking advantage of cultural resources that were existing, but also being able to essentially work with those resources to maximize the opportunity for more foodways, for more crops, for more trees that were all useful in their lifestyle. And here's what I mean about this European way of looking at the landscape. So now we get European settlement coming into New England in the 17th and 18th century. And you see this pattern of land subdivision that arises out of that settlement. And you can see this definition of tillage land and pasture and orchard. This happens to be Concord, Massachusetts, but you could just as easily create a map like this for Kennebunk, Maine. And you can see the different sizes of the lots per use. So anything that's pink on this with a little square black house in the middle of it is usually the farmyard. And then you see the areas of woodland. You see where the pasture is, which is larger acreages of land, and meadow, which is even larger. And this is a means of harnessing the landscape, but more dominating it than really working within it. The only thing they were doing here was looking at the soils, and all dry upland soils were perfect for corn and rye and oats. And then the wetter meadows were often used as summer meadow for pasturage. Here's another example. This happens to be down in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. This is an army map from 1777 during the Revolutionary War, and they captured General Prescott, who was living in a house up the hill. But before they captured him, the army cartographers recorded the landscape so that before they planned their plots to capture the general, then they could understand what landscape they were moving through. And it's a wonderful image from the mid to late 18th century of the layout of Rhode Island fields and orchards and even garden layouts that you can see here. That circle and a square pattern that you see on the left-hand side of a dooryard garden is ubiquitous to New England, and it comes in all sizes and all shapes. And you'll see that theme running through this conversation that we're having today. And here's the same kind of pattern shown in an aerial view. This is nearby in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, but you could take a picture of southern Maine and you could see this division of land. I've often put back together large tracts of land that were subdivided and subdivided and subdivided over 200 years because we tend to parcel these out in 1 to 5 to 20 acre lots, and then you can recombine them again define the boundaries of the original acreage that was first settled. We also have a lot of information underground. So years ago, when I worked as the director of landscapes at Strawberry Bank, we did 3 years worth of archaeology in the backyard of this small house that sits on Puddle Dock that was an active warehouse in 1720. And we had a gardening manual from 1680. And when we did the archaeology and we found the evidence for where the paths and the garden beds were in this backyard, they were to the letter the same size and dimensions as described in the 1680 gardening manual, because these raised beds, and I now have raised beds in my garden as well, are 6 feet wide, and anybody can reach into weed with 3 feet. Your arm takes about 3 feet of space. And so these beds that are 6 by 12 not only are pleasing proportions, but they're also very practical to be able to take care of. And these higher raised beds allowed them to get new soils in that would warm up earlier and would be profitable and productive when they didn't know what the native soils were going to be, especially in this mucky backyard along this marshy Puddle Dock area. By the sort of mid to late 18th century and into the first part of the 19th century, America is settled. The European landscape traditions are really embedded now in New England, and you begin to see this hierarchy of wealth that displays itself in the landscape. And you begin to see these wonderful paintings and images like this one of the Ezekiel Hershey Derby Farm that show this breakdown now of everything moving from a utility kind of a landscape to the opportunity for some pleasure grounds in the middle. Fences start to come up, trees get planted along roadsides. Houses in New England here are always located close to the road, but you can start to see these larger patterns of cornfields and then also some small pleasure grounds in and around these houses. Often these, no matter what size landscape you were taking care of, there was this geometric pattern that was laid out in the landscape. And here's some other really great images. These are all from Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and even one in Hartford, Connecticut. But there's a lot of similarities here in this turn of the 19th century to a quote unquote enlightened way of looking at this brave new world that we've now come from being a colony into being a new country. And we're settling and we're beginning to be prosperous, and our shipping is helping to pay off to allow us to have some fancier houses here. And if you think even here in Kennebunk along Summer Street, this is some of this wealth that's happening after the Revolutionary War and up to the 1830s that is driving a lot of this opportunity for pleasure gardens and grounds. And if you start to look in detail at some of these images, you'll see that they're not particularly regularly laid out. Some of them are still laid out for utility, like this garden of George Boyd's down here in the bottom left-hand corner, where the water source is in the middle, and then the paths radiate out to either gates in the fence or specific little ancillary buildings that they were looking to connect to. Here's another one from Ralph Earl. Beautiful, incredible painting images that we have of these landscapes from this time period. You can also see the beginnings creeping in of these little summer houses and gazebos, which are very popular, and still many of them are extant in Newburyport, Massachusetts as well. But just a spot to be able to sit and get cool in your pleasure garden and then separate that out from the farm operations on your property that you are doing. Here's another good example. This is Runlet May House in Portsmouth. This was built in 1807. And if you stood up on the roof and you looked down on the landscape that Historic New England has there, you can see how much it clearly mirrors this map from the early 19th century of the Runlet May House and Garden. And you can see the house sitting here down near the street. And you can see the smaller plots here that were given over to flowers and more pleasure ground. And then they get bigger and bigger as they go to the back. This is a large orchard, and there was a field for the horse in the back of the property as well. But you can see this whole gridded pattern laid out even now in the garden behind the Runlet May House. In the 1830s, there is a real awakening of appreciation and wanting to celebrate the American wilderness. And that comes through in paintings, it comes through in writing. Everything from Drums Along the Mohawk to the writings of William Hawthorne, and even Nature, published by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is really talking about this breakdown in the social structure of the religious social work that was here in New England that had driven the arrangement of communities for so long. And now all of a sudden, this individual relationship between people and nature and a higher spiritual being becomes a conversation that relates itself not only in church, but also out into the landscape. The founding of Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is the pictures that you're seeing here in 1831, was a combination of a desire to get more burial space for people in urban Boston, but also to be able to create a landscaped garden that featured plants that the Massachusetts Horticultural Society wanted to feature in a landscape setting. And people were intended to come here and walk these grounds like an urban park. And sure enough, in Kennebunk, we have the same version of that in Hope Cemetery. And now with Hope Woods, this has become a more active and more treasured open space right here in the middle of our downtown area. And you can see that the history of this cemetery started with the churchyard behind the Unitarian Church in 1790. And then a 3/4 acre lot gets added onto that in 1816. But in 1854, when the cemetery is incorporated, you begin to see this expansion and this layout of both trees and stones in a similar way that's been inspired by what Mount Auburn Cemetery is doing. I highly encourage all of you to both visit Hope Cemetery, but also to visit Mount Auburn Cemetery to really get a feel for what this 1830s early movement was like. It predates all of our urban parks, and our urban park designs ended up being inspired by the layout of these spaces. So it's a critical time in landscape history here in New England. The other thing that happens in the 1830s is this interest in plants and interest in horticulture. And the Society for the Promotion of Agriculture, which started in Massachusetts in 1790 and encouraged scientific farming by those in the greater New England area, had transitioned by the 1830s to the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. And a number of members began nurseries that offered plants for sale. This happens to be a catalog from 1832 for a property that the Newton Historical Society operates. They had probably 400 different varieties of plums that they were offering in this catalog, and cherries and apples and pears. But they also, as time went along, offered flowering plants and flowering shrubs and small trees that could be ordered from their nursery, shipped from Boston to anywhere in New England. And there's similar nurseries like this outside of New York and outside of Philadelphia doing the same kind of work. Just a few years later, 25 years later, the Shaker societies began to be established here in New England, in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, in New Gloucester, Maine, and even in nearby Alfred. And they were part of their industry and their economy was to produce seeds for sale. And that was one of the ways that they could connect with communities. And so you see these beginnings of catalogs from the Shaker Society as well that are being offered, and then seeds are sold to non-Shaker individuals that are interested in some of their seed exchange. Also, between 1820 and 1860, we had a real passion as we looked back after the 50-year anniversary of the American Revolution for everything French. And the French were our friends during the American Revolution. We admired everything about France. We admired their fashion. We admired their interior design. We admired their foodways, but we also admired their plant material. And Josephine Bonaparte had started a huge international rose garden at Malmaison. And her passion for acquiring roses from around the world to put into her garden spawned a real love affair with the rose bush, even here in America, especially as it was fed with this all things French movement that was happening after 1830. And so these little small shrub roses in particular are very highly scented, but you'll see a number of these in historic dooryard gardens here in New England. This happens to be Rosa spinicissima alba. It's a little tiny 2.5 to 3 foot high rose that has a lot of suckers that grow up, but has incredible beautiful smells. And sometimes the foliage on some of these also smelled wonderful, like Rosa eglantissima, and they could use that for medicinal plants or in herb concoctions to make them smell better. Okay, there we go. The other thing is that there's a counterpart to all of this, and that is that there is still a lot of hard life to be lived, especially here in northern New England. And one of the best records of that life and what life was like here, especially in Maine, is this diary of Martha Ballard from the late 18th century. And so here's a good example. This is not her house or her area, but this is from the Concord area in New Hampshire. But I picture where she was living outside of Augusta being very similar. Her husband was a surveyor, she was a midwife, and she kept a diary that records not only her midwifery work, but also her daily life of living in this sort of frontier of Maine. And so a typical entry like this is clear. There's a heavy frost, but we planted beets and parsnips and onions. I removed my garden roots. We washed 7 pounds of cotton, boiled 40 skeins of lining yard, and I feel fatigued. And I can't imagine that she would feel fatigued, especially if she spent all night long delivering babies on top of all of that. And when we had that cold weather last night, I thought, well, no better than a entry like this, because I haven't put anything into my garden yet. But here we should really be beginning, even from the 18th century till now. And town poor farms begin to happen. So again, after the Revolution, a lot of widows. Again, after the Civil War, the same thing happens. There's a lot of women who are trying to raise families on their own. They've lost their husbands in the war and they can't make it. And so towns begin to provide space for town poor farms. And often individuals, either they're living at the town poor farms or they're going there, and part of their requirement is to work the landscape and raise crops and help to feed themselves and feed the community of people that are living in these town poor farms. This happens to be one in Westport, Massachusetts. We have a small town poor farm cemetery right here in my backyard off of High Street. And it just reminds you that the economics of landscapes are not great for everybody. Here's another wonderful little map that I love to share. This is the Ferry Keeper's house up in Saco. So this again is this 1830 period that we're talking about, but this is a working landscape. So you can see the wharf and all on the Saco River. If you went to Biddeford, you could raise a flag and the ferry keeper would leave his house, get in his boat on this wharf, cross the Saco River, and then pick you up and then bring you back over to the Saco side of the river. But this is a wonderful record of landscape. There's a goose ground here with this little round circular area here, I think, which is probably feed for the goose. Here's the wharf. Here's stores for storing goods that are going to be shipped back and forth across the river. But here's the dwelling house, the brickyard, the outhouse, the stable, and then the big garden that's right here. This is a landscape that combines his livelihood with his garden and his living spaces, and really records this kind of gritty mixture of utility and pleasure that happens here in Seacoast, Maine, even in the 1830s. Now, if you were to map out the backyards of the Summer Street houses, they would probably be very similar to these pictures here from Newburyport, Massachusetts. This 1830 period, because we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution, tends, for those that lived in the 20th century and were interested in colonial life, to be the era that they look back to see what colonial gardens were like. And so you begin in the 1930s to see this reflection back to document what yards look like in the 1830s. And this happens to be a property in Salem and a property in Newburyport, but we could just as easily lay out a garden, for some of the properties here along Summer Street, because the same kind of wealth was being developed through shipping and through small industry that was driving the ability to hold these gardens and to have pleasure gardens and utility at the very back of the garden for raising fruits and vegetables and stabling your horse that were happening here in the Kennebunks. And you can see that there's these small spaces near the house that are a little more ornamented, and then they evolve down to these more regularly spaced rectilinear plots for fruits and vegetables as you get further and further away from the house. And this is what some of those gardens look like in picture form. These were all taken in the 19th century, and thanks to the Library of Congress and Historic New England, we've got some wonderful record of what these look like. And when I mentioned before that circle and the square pattern for garden design, whether it's a small garden or a large garden, is ubiquitous, this is what it looks like in the mid-19th century. So you get a little circular space here in the middle, and then you get these parterre spaces on either side. These spaces in the middle may have started as water cisterns for collecting water, because you could dip your bucket or your watering can into that water and then very easily water the garden plots around it. But by the Victorian era, these had been filled in and were used either for urns or for more ornamental plant material in the middle of the garden as an accent point. And by the colonial revival in the 20th century, this is where the bee-skep or the sundial usually ends up. But this pattern on the landscape is so typical. And often these were edged with really low boxwood or sometimes with strawberries, and then filled in the middle with a riot of different kinds of English garden material and roses. And you'll see the roses that I was talking about before, even in these beds over here. And you can still see those gardens today. So this happens to be one in the backyard of what is now a senior citizen home in Newburyport. But this garden dates back to the 1820s and is still maintained today. And you see some of the summer house like you saw in those paintings from Ralph Earl earlier on. These tend to be a combination. So in plan and pattern form, they actually follow a very French parterre kind of a garden design. But because we are New England and not do France, we tended to fill them with this rich variety of perennials and sometimes fruits and vegetables. Sometimes these gardens were inserted underneath small orchards besides houses as well, and the orchard trees become the overstory trees for the gardens. By the Civil War and after the Civil War, the Victorian period had a different kind of wealth associated with it, mostly from industry, especially the milling and manufacturing industry here in New England. And it also led to an exuberance of passion for not necessarily long-lasting gardens, but the new plants that are coming in from Japan and China after they open in 1854, or this ability to get cheap and readily available annuals from the local greenhouses and nurseries in each community. And so this thought of carpet bedding comes out, and you start to see these much more elaborate garden designs begin to develop. This is the Goodwin residence, which has now been moved, and it's located at Strawberry Bank. And you can see, as we had restored the gardens there, what this looks like with all of this influx of annuals and carpet bedding, as it was called. Also, the lawnmower was developed by now, and so you could clip your lawn. It didn't have to be long, or it didn't have to be mown by a sheep or a goat or anybody that was available to chew up grass. So with the invention of the lawnmower, you get these flat green spaces that then you could put one of these beds in the middle of and really accent your front yard or your backyard as you please. Later on, you get the wonderful development of gardens like Celia Thaxter's garden out at the Isles of Shoals. And here's where maybe the plan for the garden has dissolved a little bit into something more irregular and a little more vernacular. But it certainly is still filled with this passion for poppies and roses and iris, and things that in this case Celia Thaxter is bringing across from Rye, New Hampshire on the boat to the Isles of Shoals. And her friends that are coming out to the island to live with her for the summer are beginning to paint and capture her garden and give us a wonderful documentation for what her garden looked like. And the restored garden, if you get a chance to go see it, it's very small, but it really is quite wonderful on Star Island. They're in Rhode Island. So in Celia Thaxter's garden is in the 1890s, and in 1913, you can still see these dooryard gardens. These are women's spaces. And after the Civil War, the way that women maintained their dooryard gardens was believed to be a reflection on how they would tend and raise their families. So these were considered to be spaces that were kept with tender love and care, just like raising your children, with the ability to not necessarily grow food for the family, but really be able to grow something of pleasure and pride and conversation with your friends. Garden clubs begin to develop at this period. Plant societies develop at this period, mostly for women, and a way for women to share information about gardening. Here's another wonderful little garden. This is the Wendell Garden in Portsmouth. This is a cookie cutter. It's a garden that was designed from a set of tiles from a 7-tile game that came from China. And the Wendell family was based, again, on it was a shipping family. And so supposedly the story behind this garden is that those tiles in that game came from China back on the ship, and they used them to design the beds in this garden. They're very unusual, and this is a very unique garden. but you can see here the pear tree at the back there and the style of fencing that's being used, and then the phlox and the peonies and the other things in this garden that are so popular in this early colonial revival period, remembering back to what grandmother's garden had looked like in the 1830s, but celebrating it in a brand new, bigger way. The Perkins House in York, Maine is another good example of this. This was all created in the early 20th century, but it is a reflection of this interest and this desire to go back and celebrate the same kinds of plants and the same style of gardening that was happening here in New England in the 18th and early 19th century. Hamilton House in South Berwick is another really good example. And these beds and borders in this garden was much more elaborate than that at the Perkins House, but still showcases this passion for the perennial garden, the heavily scented garden, the roses, and the grandmother's garden kind of theme that runs through all of this. Here's another one. This is the Langdon House in Portsmouth as well. And again, you can see this layout and this plan for that garden with its long rose arbor, and then its smaller individual garden rooms, if you want to call them that. And again, Historic New England has done a really nice job of taking care of these beds and borders and arbors for you to be able to walk and experience as you look at them. Again, I mentioned the garden club began they started in the 19-teens and flourished between the 19-teens and the 1950s. They're still very active today. This happens to be an incredibly wonderful picture of the Piscataqua Garden Club that's still going in York. They meet at the reading room. And they began with a desire to help to improve towns, keep billboards out of communities, and keep the roadsides clean. And so this is gardening dress for women in the 1920s. Kind of look like old Girl Scout uniforms to me, but just a wonderful image of what that movement was and how important and influential it was for women and for gardening here in New England, for sure. Between 1900 and 1950, there's an antithesis that starts to happen, particularly after World War I, when soldiers had come back from England and France and seen the tiny little dooryard gardens that existed there and recognized that the home gardening was as ubiquitous to individual regions as anything else. And so this inspiration to celebrate the natural materials that were available in any community and to combine them into a new kind of landscape gardening that was a do-it-yourself kind of garden was really popular. The Craftsman magazine was begun during this period, and they promoted these ideas. This is one of their images for an ideal house and landscape from 1904. But you can also see some of the little gates and arborways that entered into some of these garden spaces that actually were created and built right from the Craftsman magazine plans. And here's a really good example. This is a house from 1906, completely built out of a pattern that was featured in the Craftsman magazine. And you can see not only the wonderful the stylistic pieces of the architecture here, but when you start to look at the landscape that's surrounding it, this is a garden that's a combination of vegetables and fruits and flowers all mashed together. There's no separation of vegetables in one place and flowers in another. The rope walk that you see there on the left is for roses, for climbing roses, and allowed you to have a shady way to go from the house out into the garden and then back again. And these kinds of images from the arts and crafts movement are really typical. This is the backyard at the Cushing House in Newburyport, and you can see that the little square patterns of granite were something that could be mined, just like the foundation stones for the buildings in Newburyport, nearby and brought in and used as paving stones. And the story with this garden is that the cobble that you see on either side of those granite pavers was brought in as ballast on ships into Newburyport, and then it was waste material that they were using up in the garden. But ferns, mayapple, indigenous trees, and even orchard trees combine into these landscapes that are very naturalistic feeling. They celebrate the natural materials and the natural plant material that's here, but you can almost always find cultivated plants mixed in with these as they go. And the Camden Amphitheater up in Camden, Maine is another really good example and a high style example of what this arts and crafts movement was all about. This was designed by Fletcher Steele, who was a landscape architect that felt very strongly about using indigenous materials, but in brand new ways, and usually very simple ways. There was a wonderful stonemason that he worked with up in Camden to create this whole garden. This was essentially a WPA project, not sponsored by the federal government, but just by a local philanthropist in Camden in 1931. And you see all this local granite that's brought in. The trees that are within the amphitheater are all birches, again, native to the Camden area here in Maine. And then you see these nods to the colonial revival in the little brick ticket houses that he put on either side. But this view to the natural landscape and this connection to the harbor in Camden and this relationship back and forth between this new design and the harbor was all integral to the design and the desire to be able to create something that was sprung up out of the landscape of Camden. And here's another example. This is inspired by that same movement. This happens to be a private residence down in Concord, Massachusetts. But the plantings here around this pool and the fact that the fencing is all dark green and the stone pillars relates to this want that the meadow has grazing cows in it. And so trying to be able to borrow that landscape and take advantage of it when you're sitting by this brand newly constructed pool and have the garden here not compete with that greater landscape that's all around you was part of the desire as we were creating the landscape design for this house. After 1950, 1949, there was a shift in this arts and crafts trend that had been happening. And there was a look based on a wonderful exhibition that happened in Paris in 1925 to go to the simplest, most reduced forms of line and form and sculpting of the land that you possibly could. And so you begin to see this mid-century modern movement take hold, first with landscape architects and with architects, and then later with individuals, and then later with mass housing that's getting produced. So the houses that begin to emerge out of this right after World War II are very sleek, they're very simple, they tend to have very simple lines. Even you can see the rail on the top of this guest house here at Field Farm is very simple and sleek in design. This pattern for these stone walls that are here makes you feel like there's really no garden here at all, that you stepped out of the house onto a grass terrace and then out into the meadow, and then you can see the views to the mountains. I think the biggest feature of this whole period of architecture is the picture window. The ability to create these large windows that looked out onto the landscape all of a sudden drove a very different perspective about the landscape. And it was a landscape that you could appreciate from being inside the building. And so the conscious design of the landscape had to be done by starting in the living room and looking out that picture window to see if you could create a picture, just like you might hang a picture on your wall, but using the existing landscape that was outside. This is a guest house. If you want to have a mid-century experience, you can come and you can stay here for the night up in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and live like madmen. All the furnishings are still dating to 1955, and the whole experience and the whole property is all geared to this mid-century modern movement. Here's another more subtle example of the same thing. This is in Tyringham, Massachusetts. And here's a case where this maple forest was eroded a little bit and a garden was inserted underneath it, but with a conscious design that these circular garden rooms could evolve out of the natural landscape that was there. This happens to have a 19th century house on it, so it doesn't have a building with picture windows that are looking out onto this landscape. But it's a much more subtle and sleek look at manipulating the nature that's around you and the landscape that's around you in a design sense, rather than for farming or for ecological habitat. This is intentionally done for landscape design, but it feels and looks very, very natural. I just put this in here because I think out of all these different gardening styles that we've been looking at, everybody needs to remember that the garden tools that we use today are still the same. This is a 17th century gardener's manual, and they're identifying the different kinds of tools you need to use in the garden. And I think each of us could take a look at these and probably label 95% of these gardening tools even today. And I've got these same things hanging in the newer version of these hanging in my garage down below my office here. So that's sort of a quick evolution of landscape history here in New England. And I wanted to encourage you to think about the landscape as as a history textbook. So if you think about wherever you go, wherever you wander, whatever trip you want to take this summer, take a look around you and see if you can get any clues as to the history of that place without having to have somebody tell you what it was. And there are ways for you to pay attention to this. And I just wanted to give you a few little hints so you could start to think about it. There was a wonderful cultural geographer in England named William Hoskins who said that the landscape is like a symphony, and you could go to the symphony and sit in a chair and listen to the music and appreciate it for what it has to offer. But if you studied that piece of music before you went to the symphony and you listened to all of the themes that were going to weave themselves in and out of that piece of music, then you'd go to the symphony and you'd sit in that chair and you'd have a very different kind of an experience. It would deepen your appreciation for the music. And so the same thing is true when you think about the landscape, whether you're in Kennebunk or you're at Mount Katahdin or you're down in Boston, Massachusetts. You can look around and you can start to look for these themes that weave themselves through the landscape as we've layered and layered and layered history upon itself in this three-dimensional textbook. Often, when I'm walking on a farm property, I warn the farmers to be careful of just flat stones that are out in the fields, especially those within a reasonable vicinity of the house, because more often than not, they mark the location of an old well. And they always scare me a little bit because I'll say, if you pick up this big stone on the top and move it aside, and sometimes they just look like a field stone, you might find a 9-foot deep pit underneath there. And of course, the archaeologists love these wells because that's usually where you threw some of your remains, especially when the well went dry. So they're usually rich in archaeological materials after the well has gone dry. But these hand-dug wells would only last for so long. They'd absorb the water from the soils around them, and then they'd go dry, and then another well would get dug. Privy pits are the same way. Sometimes they're lined with stone like this, and other times they're just a hole in the ground where everybody dumped their refuse. But they're here and they're around us, and we don't pay attention to them because we don't need them so much anymore. But they still give us a lot of information about the landscape and the people that lived on the landscape. Sometimes you'll find the remains of gardens. This happens to be a rhododendron garden from Newburyport, Massachusetts, and there's only one rhododendron plant left. You can see what the picture of the garden looked like up in the right-hand corner, but you can see all this incredibly beautiful stonework. This, again, dates to that arts and crafts period where they're using all the natural stone and even the native rhododendrons from Newburyport to be able to incorporate them into a woodland garden here that all that's left is the stone walls. Here's those land patterns I was talking about. If you look at a map or you look at Google or you watch your aerial views on your car as you're traveling, you can begin to see these patterns that emerge out of settlement and change over time. This is the farm that's right behind the liquor store on Route 95. If you head down the New Hampshire Turnpike, there's a small farm up there, and they took some of the land for making that liquor store. But these land patterns are pretty typical for us all over New England. The other thing to pay attention to, since stone walls are one of the most ubiquitous and regionally identifiable landscape features that we have here, is that these walls change over time. And Tom Wessels and others have studied these walls and the evolution of how they developed to tell a little bit about the land use around them. But often when you get a stone wall in an urban setting like this, you'll see this is a 1790 farmhouse, and then it changed into a gentleman's farm in the 1860s, and it got a whole colonial revival update in the 19 teens. But you can see this old field wall was formalized a little bit, and then see this break in the wall right here where all the stones above it are much smaller. That's because during the colonial revival, the couple that lived here did not want people to easily see what they were doing. And so they raised the height of this wall from 3.5 feet to 5 feet. And this whole top layer is new stone that was added on top of the old wall. And then they formalized the old wall just a little bit. And you can see these changes. If there's a stone wall that you see that has a lot of these small stones in it, then undoubtedly the land next to it had been tilled or farmed. And as these stones came up, they were thrown up onto the stone wall, where more often, if there's road construction or there's bigger projects going on where building foundations are being done, there are these larger boulders that end up getting put next to stone walls near houses or near roadsides that were coming out of the construction of those roads. Fences and gates, there's a whole range of fences and gates that you can look at that speak to the style and the period of the house or the neighborhood or the community that you're in. And if you wander through Kennebunkport, you'll see a great collection of those. Same with the gates and the fences along Summer Street too, from that mid-19th century period. Again, plant material we were talking about, you could date any one of these flowers that you see in this garden, whether it's the zinnias or these wonderful Nicotiana sylvestris here. This is a wonderful Victorian plant because it had this great big leaves to it, so it looked very exotic. The Victorians loved that plant. These zinnias or some of these other phlox and some of the other things that are in the garden all relate to that colonial revival period, that grandmother's garden period. This happens to be that arts and crafts house that we were looking at before. But you can talk about the plants that became popular at different periods, even in your own garden, as a bit of history as well. And plant material like trees becomes really, really important. This happens to be a whole row of sugar maples that are going into the William Cullen Bryant homestead up in Cummington, Massachusetts. I'm worried about these trees because they're not liking this warming climate that we have, and they're all over 100 years old at this point, so they're very fragile. But if you take a walk in the woods this spring, especially right now, in the next 3 weeks, you may find some old orchards and apple trees or pear trees that are starting to bloom, whether it's the rootstock from the orchard tree or the original orchard tree itself. You'll see these funny little bits of bloom happening on a regular gridded pattern, even in the woods, because the woods have come in and taken over the orchard. So you'll see some old landscape uses come to bloom right at this time of the year now as we begin to go into our spring season. Site furnishings, again, become really important. This is a house in Beverly, Massachusetts, where we've been doing a lot of work. And you can see that this family had a brother who was the curator of Asian art at the MFA in Boston. And so you see all of this nod to Asian art, Asian gateways, Asian tiles here in this garden that was built during the colonial revival. Also look for ghost features. Now, you won't see these this time of the year, and you won't see them in a summer like we had last summer with so much rain. But when this garden was developed, this property had 2 different gardens to it. And the garden that predated this version that you see here, I'm going to show you in a second. But those lighter stripes in the lawn that you see are former pathways for that previous garden. And when we garden, we put a lot of compostable material into the soil where the garden is going to be so that it can hold moisture and be better for the plant growth for the plants that are in there. But when we build a path, we take away that organic material and we take away the good soil and we put in drainage material and then we top dress it with some gravel. And so in a drought, those areas that have no compostable soils in them that used to be pathways drain really quickly. And so even if they're covered with grass, they don't hold the water as much. And so they're the first to burn out in the summertime. Foundations will do this too. You can find old building foundations because they're just covered with a light dressing of loam and grass. And in the heat of the summer, there's no water to help the grass survive. And so they're the first thing to burn out. So this happened to be an old garden at Fort Ticonderoga I was working on, and we had a tea on a hot August day. And I was able to talk to them about the earlier garden, which was this, that you could just see and its ghost features here in this later rendition of the garden that happened later on. So I hope it's quick and it's a fast walk through all of this, but I hope this has really helped you to see that we've got a lot around us every single day that we can look at and pay attention to and try to understand. And often, if you have a historic house, by understanding these historic periods and some of these trends, you can then use that as inspiration for new landscape design. All of this is brand new landscape design here, but it was inspired by the history of the house and the history of the landscape during its period in the 19th and early 20th century as we put a new garden into this space. So that is all that I have for you. I'm so happy to take questions if there are any, or comments or conversation that you might be able to have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn this back over to Deb. And maybe Cynthia.
So folks, as a reminder, please feel free to type anything into the chat, or I believe you're welcome to unmute and just speak right into your microphone. But as as people are perhaps thinking of questions, because that was a whole lot of information that I'm sure everyone is still processing. I'm always amazed, Lucinda, at just the amount of information that there is on landscapes and gardening. And I'm just wondering, this is kind of a far back question, but what got you interested in working in this
In this
role?
whole field?
Yeah.
You know, I grew up in an old house. I grew up in an old Victorian house that was a real mess when my folks bought it in 1963. And it needed everything. It needed roof, it needed wallpaper, it needed plaster repair. The plaster ceilings were falling down. I mean, it had everything. And I loved working with them on that house. It was a do-it-yourself job for sure for many, many years. My dad still lives there. But I liked the outside of the houses more than the inside. So when I was thinking about what to do with my career, I thought that I would rather be outside than in, but I recognized that not many people were working in this whole field of historic landscape preservation and design. And I just happened to be lucky to be coming out of school at a point when the National Park Service was coming up with all of their definitions for historic landscapes and their tools for being able to work with landscape preservation. So it was a combination of luck and desire.
Usually is.
I have a question. It didn't really occur to me until you mentioned it halfway through the presentation, but yeah, how did people take care of their lawns before the invention of lawnmowers?
Yeah, thank goodness for those sheep and those cows and those goats, honestly. Or liked along grass, you know. So I mean, you could scythe them, and especially that's why those dooryard gardens were so small, and there was very little lawn in those spaces. When you look at those plans that I was showing you, they're mostly garden and pathways rather than any kind of lawn, because the idea for a big lawn really didn't come about until after the Civil War, when we had a lawnmower to be able to mow them in a bigger way.
And also I have another question. You mentioned before, what exactly is a pleasure ground?
So the pleasure ground, that's a term that comes from England in the early 18th century. This English estates that everybody wants to go visit now had landscape designers. They were called landscape gardeners, who felt that the gardens at Versailles were very contrived and very formal, and that the landscape in England was so beautiful that if they could manipulate that natural landscape a little bit, they could create something more beautiful than nature could create itself. And so they defined areas within a walking distance around those big estate houses as a pleasure ground. And often they framed them either with fences or something called a ha-ha wall, which was a wall that was sunk into the grade and in a ditch. And then the cows and the sheep could graze in the fields, and you could see them from where you were, but they didn't come up to the house itself because that wall and that ditch stopped them from coming in. So those pleasure grounds in 18th century England were large areas, and often those lawns would be mown or scythed, you know, to keep them pleasant for walking in. In New England, we think about them as the little dooryard gardens, or the spaces where there's pleasant flowers that are totally for pleasure and not for any kind of utility that are there. So in my yard, it's my driveway. I have a little garden in the middle of my driveway that has a lot of fun plants in it, and then I have my vegetable garden in the backyard. So
I included your name and your email in the chat as well as your website. So if anyone has further questions for Cindy, you can certainly email her or visit her website. Again, I also will be sending this video out for everyone on the registration list. So if you missed anything from before or you had to jet out early, you're seeing this now. So it's great. So,
good.
yeah, that's it for me.
Right. Well,
Excellent.
thank you for allowing me to do this. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come, and it is a lot of information, so probably good everybody can hear it a couple of times to be able to go through it again.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting, and we appreciate you coming and speaking to us.
That's right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a nice day. Enjoy the cold spring day.
Yes, that's right.
All
See
right.
everyone soon. Bye.
Bye.